Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Here was a vitally important propaganda method that is often used. The essence of propaganda is the us versus them tactic. Stereotypes are at the heart of all propaganda. You can't trust civilians with guns. You can't trust them with freedom. Therefore, the government should be free to rule others, and only the government should have the monopoly on guns. Their purpose is to create the perception that our actions are always ethical and honorable, while those of our opponents are always unethical and dishonorable. So, those Branch Davidians in the church, they were up to no good. We, the FBI, who murdered them, well, that was virtuous. You can't hold us to the same standard. Here's an old cartoon. Plan of action for the U.S. Spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery. Bust the government. Blame the capitalists for the failure. Junk the Constitution and declare a dictatorship. So they run up the debt. They bail out the banks. And then things are terrible. They spend $22 trillion to keep people in poverty through the war on poverty from Lyndon Johnson, and you don't get good results. So they blame freedom, always. And people are uneducated. Well, that's because the government has a stronghold on education. Nope, it's because we need a bigger government and more education. So what they do is they say greed and idiocy and lack of information applies to the free market. People are uninformed, so we need government to regulate it. Well, people are uninformed about who they vote for, so the same thing applies. There we have an us versus them, double standard. We are the 99%. No, you're not. If you live in America and you earn more than $32,350 annually, you are in the top 1% of the planet. Do these people in Haiti or Zimbabwe have the right to forcibly take money from you? No. This is a fake us versus them divide. AOC has 6.8 million followers on Twitter. I haven't checked, but I think it's just under 6.8 million. If she really believed in equality, she'd be saying, hey, we need more followers for people like Keith Knight and James Corbett. I believe in equality and diversity of thought. Well, of course they don't. Bernie, this applies to all of them, but here are just 4 examples. Bernie says that government has the right to make laws that everyone has to abide by, and he says he believes in equality. What, can I make a law that you have to abide by? Do the Koch brothers have the right to make laws? Why does only government get a monopoly on laws? Because government, us, the kind, virtuous people, it's us versus them. We're in it for the greater good. Everyone else is in it for themselves. There's that great Thomas Sowell quote. Why is it seen as greed to want to keep your own money, but it's not greedy to want to forcibly take other people's money? Cenk Uygur and Secular Talk have literally billions of views on YouTube, and I have under billions of views on YouTube. Surely they'd be promoting me and saying, well, we really need to increase the amount of equality, because equality is something that's inherently good. We don't want just 1% of people getting all the attention, hogging it all up. That's just bad for things in general. Now, another us versus them is white versus black. Now, this could be played either way, but the way it's playing out now is in so many of these fake cases. Tawana Brawley, Trayvon was just having Skittles. Meanwhile, he was really beating Zimmerman's head into the ground. The Covington case where, the kid, straight white male, walks up to the Indian just trying to get back to his roots, enjoying his sing-along. And then, the white Christian just invades his space and tries to colonize him. No, the opposite is the truth, but it's all about building the narrative. Ahmaud Arbery was murdered for being black. How do you know they wouldn't have done the same thing to a white person who had just gone into their construction site that was clearly closed off? I'm not saying that was a reasonable response. For the same thing about Trayvon, I don't know if Zimmerman was totally justified in his claim of self-defense, but we know that it's fake, that he was just walking and then he was murdered for no reason. Ahmaud Arbery was just jogging and then he was murdered. And Jesse Smollett, 2 white supremacists were waiting for him at 2 a.m. outside his Chicago residency with bleach and a rope. These are all fake, but they all get into the mindset of us versus them, the people who want social justice, and then everyone else who's just a bigot. There's no real arguments against small government. There's just racists and sexists. There's so many of these that books have been written about them. Hate Crime Hoaxes by Wilfred Riley. You have Leard Wilcox writing Crying Wolf, Hate Crime Hoaxes in America. You have a fake hate map where all these fake crimes are exposed. Copyright 1994. There were fake hate crimes in the 90s, and they were high then. You can imagine how bad they are now. Here's a list of hoax hate crimes in the Trump era. Daily Wire. We actually have a graph that is kept of all these hate crimes. Now, you'll only see that sometimes you'll have as many as 60 in a year, or maybe 4 or 5 in a month. But that is a lot. Think of the narrative pushing that Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Jesse Smollett, Tawana Brawley, the Covington kids. Those are big stories that really capture our attention and frame the way people see the world. So it matters that there are quite a few hoaxes. And of course they say, well, the problem with government monopolizing police and forcing people to fund the police and the police having extra rights, the problem is skin color, when the opposite is the truth. More whites are killed by police. But they are a higher percentage of the populace. So what? If the fact that they're twice as likely to be shot by the police, we'd hear twice as many stories, but they only get reported on in order to create an us versus them narrative. In absolute numbers, more white people than black people are killed in police shootings because white people outnumber black people in America. Yeah, that doesn't address why we really only hear about the white cases. How about lynchings? Do you know that the lynching and the slave narrative is always black versus white? That's the false divide. The true divide is some people believe in voluntarism, other people believe in violence. That's the problem with lynching. Skin color was behind it. Also, according to the Tuskegee Institute, we had 1,200 whites lynched between 1882 and 1968. So it wasn't just blacks, it was disproportionately blacks. But so what? Men are disproportionately in prison. That doesn't necessarily mean that only men are being targeted, but in order to create the narrative, they have to fake these ideas of us versus them. How about slavery? Well, North Carolina's largest slave owner in 1860 was a black plantation owner named William Ellison. You had Anthony Johnson, the one of the earliest slave owners in America, who was a free black person. We have The Root, a very pro-black organization. In their article, Did Black People Own Slaves? Citing the journal The Known World of Free Black Slaveholders, a research note on the scholarship of Carter G. Woodson. The problem with slavery is it initiated violence against peaceful people, not, skin color was involved. You also have people like Nicholas Augustus, as you can see on the left-hand side, who owned 215 slaves. If your focus on slavery is about skin color, you're missing the point. The problem was violence, not skin color. Now, you can look at the narrative of, we know cases like Eric Garner, Philando Castillo, these, most recently George Floyd, these are put in the media and propagated. Now, those are all tragedies, absolutely, but we know there's an agenda because of the double standard. How many people know who Duncan Lemp is? How many people know who Daniel Schaefer is? How many people know who Kelly Thomas is? These were on camera, blatantly unjustified murders of white men by the police. The Duncan Lemp footage hasn't even been released, and he was just sleeping in his home when they raided him for a red flag law. The reason you don't hear about these cases is because the media is trying to, and leftists in general, and people on the right, creating the double standard. As I mentioned earlier, when the military does it, it's for democracy. When anyone else does it, it's because they're evil. We have some sources here. Peter Moskus, an assistant professor at New York City's University John Jay College of Criminal Justice, has concluded that during the period ranging from May 2013 to April 15, roughly 49% of those killed by law enforcement officers were white. Only 30% were black. Now, that again disproportionately affects blacks, but it also disproportionately affects males. That's because they're more likely to be involved in crime. These are all unjust. The point is, the propaganda method is us versus them, false divide. Adjusted for the homicide rate, whites are 1.7 times more likely than blacks to die at the hands of police, Moskos said. Adjusted for the racial disparity at which police are feloniously killed, whites are 1.3 times more likely than blacks to die at the hands of police. How many people have heard of Tony Timpa? This is a man who was suffocated to death on camera as the other ones were also on camera. And we didn't really hear much about it. Here's an article from a local Dallas affiliate. Dallas police officers mocking Tony Timpa was strategy. So they're on camera suffocating him to death, and after killing him, they mock him. Now, why did they do this? Well, of course, the police officers aren't greedy. This guy was being greedy. It's us versus them. He was trying to resist us. We killed him and mocked him, but that was just to see if he was alive. Two of the officers involved in the 2016 death of Tony Timpa told Dallas Police Department leaders that they mocked the handcuffed 32-year-old while he was pinned to the ground as part of a strategy to prompt a response from him. Oh, never mind. Murder's justified so long as you're trying to get a response. Look at the numbers of whites versus blacks killed by police. Again, this doesn't account for a percentage in the population, but still, if there are twice as many white victims, we'd hear twice as much about them from the media if there wasn't a bias. We have Roland Fryer, the black professor at Harvard, an empirical analysis of racial differences in police use of force. In his July 2017 study, he concludes that blacks are about 50% more likely to physically use their hands against a black suspect, yet they are less likely to be shot and killed by police, which is the opposite if all you do is watch CNN. Blacks are 23.5% less likely to be shot by police relative to whites, according to Roland Fryer, an empirical analysis of racial differences in police use of force. According to the reverse racism effect, are cops more hesitant to shoot black than white suspects? They say police are 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects. This is according to Washington State University. Now, we have someone from the Black Panthers, King Shamir Shabazz. You want freedom? You're going to have to kill some crackers. You're going to have to kill some of their babies. Well, now, it's assumed that anytime someone says, I'm against affirmative action, white supremacy, but when this guy says something, it doesn't even make the news, even though he's out there protesting it. Oh, anytime, someone waves a Confederate flag, that's pure evil. A guy says something like this, moving on. Another method of dividing people is based on the slavery narrative again. We have blacks were engaged in forced labor, and this was a terrible thing that happened uniquely to them. Well, yes, but men were engaged in forced labor under the guise of the draft, which is probably worst forced labor because you're more likely to get killed and get your hands blown off, get your arm blown off, get your legs blown off, suffer from PTSD, watch your friends die. Being forced to commit atrocities has got to be terrible. Could you imagine if only blacks were drafted? Well, obviously, this is a case of men were discriminated against. So it's not men versus women, black versus white. It's violence versus voluntarism. We could even look at the black on white statistics for homicides. Blacks are more likely to kill whites than whites are to kill blacks. It's just boring to continuously look at the same statistics and realize that the opposite of what they're saying is actually true. Let's move on to the male versus female false divide, us versus them. Coronavirus seems to be infecting and killing more men than women, says the Wall Street Journal. So how does CNN respond to this? Well, there is a disproportionate amount of blacks being killed by this. Well, there's a million different factors. Why would you focus on that? To create a false divide and a justification for more government power. AOC says COVID deaths are disproportionately spiking in black plus brown communities. Why? Because the control of yada, yada, yada. Well, they're also disproportionately affecting men. So why are they talking about the black disproportionate infection rate and not the male? Because they are creating an us versus them false divide. So CNN finally responds to it and says, coronavirus is killing more men, but the lockdown is disastrous for women and their rights. From a spike in domestic violence and restricted access to family planning services to disproportionate economic impact, the lockdown measures put in place to stop the outbreak are hurting women and their basic rights a lot more than men. So yeah, men are dying more, but it hurts women a lot more. That is just incredible. Another way men are discriminated against is a large amount of them, in America at least, are genitally mutilated at birth or a short time after. Another way men are disproportionately discriminated against is they still have to apply for the draft or sign up for the social selective services. Imagine Are you going to be forced to go into a war zone against your will and you blindly pick this? If it was just women legally who had to sign up for this, would they be saying it's sexist or racist or classist or something? Of course they would. But us versus them, it doesn't apply. We have totally different standards. Here's what the feminist world is really worried about. Is sleep a feminist issue? This is how men steal our sleep. What if you're a lesbian woman and you share a bed with another woman? Does that woman not steal your sleep? It's not stealing if you're voluntarily involved in a relationship. There are costs. How women are stealing men's money after they go to work all day. No, that's an arrangement they voluntarily entered into. That's a clear us versus them false divide. Rarely do you get it that in your face. And if you want to talk about disproportionate effects, as they do with blacks to whites, well, they'd also mention that Asians have higher incomes than whites. They'd also mention that Jews have higher incomes than whites. A lot of immigrants from Africa, on average, have higher incomes than whites. But it's all about creating a false divide. Men are disproportionately suicide victims. They're disproportionately incarcerated. They are disproportionately killed at the workplace. They're disproportionately homeless. They're disproportionately homicide victims. But, sexism against women, I guess, is the main narrative that goes around still. The biggest one that just won't seem to die is the wage gap myth. Women still only make 79% of what men make in 2019. Another great Thomas Sowell quote is, well, if they made less, employers would just hire only women and beat their competitors out of business. Well, women have different jobs and they work less hours. And they're less likely to be homeless, so it's not really affecting them negatively. It's like saying 18-year-olds make 50% of what 50-year-olds make. This is obviously they're being discriminated against. This is a blatant lie to give a false divide. It's also part of another agenda to, save it for another video. President Obama announces rules for closing the gender pay gap. Barack Obama, president who has the right to make executive orders, very worried about equality. And why didn't Barack Obama address any of these other things? He talked about the pay gap, but not the death gap or the life gap. Women, on average, live many years or a few years longer than men do. But look at this, 93% incarcerated, 93% workplace deaths. Imagine if it were 93% blacks versus whites. It's just so ridiculous. Finally, the great false divide is Democrat versus Republican. Here is the problem with the Democrat versus Republican. There was no principal difference between them, yet it's always us versus them. The Democrats are terrible. No, the Republicans are terrible. This is what's referred to as the false dichotomy on the left-right paradigm. So, for example, both parties, Democrat and Republican, are the same on the major issues. They both believe the NSA has a right to spy and engage in mass surveillance. They both support the CIA. They're both fine with killing civilians in wars overseas based on lies. They both support taxation. They both support the drug war. They both support the Federal Reserve, sales tax, income tax, Department of Education, protectionism such as tariffs, immigration controls, the Food and Drug Administration, economic regulation, licensing, corporate taxation. All of these things are totally unjustified. Even gun control you could add to that. Donald Trump with the bump stock ban and the red flag laws. So that is another false divide to keep people from seeing what is genuinely important. This is what Mark Passio says. He says there is only one true divide that separates humanity into two distinct types of individuals. The criterion for this divide is whether or not an individual believes in authority and therefore believes that there was legitimacy to slavery. In other words, if I have the right to rule you or initiate aggression against you, I am saying that I have a better claim to your body, your life, your time, and your property than you do. I am an authority over you. Or what if I believe that a group of people called government or the Mormon Church or Amazon has the right to force you to abide by their laws, not voluntary contracts like employment or going over to someone's house or having an agreement with someone. This is, I have the right to make rules that you have to follow. You do not have the right to make rules against me, and you don't have the right to opt out of associating with me on property that I've acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. So, the one true divide is voluntarists versus violence advocates, people who believe in libertarianism, versus people who believe in statism. I hope this was productive. Thank you for watching. Keith Knight, don't tread on anyone.